So I have a great pleasure of welcoming Fabian Dablander to Researcher's Desk. Fabian's one of the co-authors on a study in Nature on climate change engagement by scientists. And he's kindly agreed to speak with us today about that work and about the overall topic of climate change engagement among scientists. We really appreciate you taking your time, Fabian, to be with us today. I warmly welcome you to Researcher's Desk. I'm going to turn my camera off right now, and will be there in the background and jumping in if there's any issues, and you just need to speak up, and I'll show up if there's any problems. Welcome to Researcher's Desk.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me. Um, I should say that I'm on a week-long workshop in a remote island in Spain. So I hope the Wi-Fi doesn't die on me mid-talk and the surroundings are quiet enough. I think I found a nice spot. Well, I'm going to talk about going beyond research, climate change engagement of scientists. And before doing so, I want to do a little bit of an advertisement actually for an event that we're running for the second time from April 28 to May 22 in 2025, called the Amsterdam Complexity School on Climate Change, where we bring together around 40 early career researchers and people from industry and NGOs and social movements who work on projects related to climate change. And we have some nice speakers already. And the structure is having talks and input by scientists and politicians and artists in the morning, and then in the afternoon engage in project work throughout the whole week. So if you're interested in attending, or if you know PhD students, postdocs, assistant professors, or people outside the academy that could be interested in this, please feel free to forward them the event. Applications are now open. All right, let's go to the talk. As you know, there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And while these, warnings have become more stark over the years, they're not particularly new. We had so far 6 IPCC reports of varying aesthetical appeal. We had a conference of the party, of the conference of the party, conference of the parties, of the conference of the parties. But global emissions are still rising. They're not plateauing, they're not going down. And we have, of course, also wealthy nations who have contributed historically the most to climate change and wider Earth system breakdown, continuing to license oil and gas licenses at a record pace. So it's really almost a slap in the face, if you want, of the scientific community around climate change. And we have, United Nations Environmental Gap Report is kind of self-ironic, saying it's almost like a broken record, right? Temperatures hit new highs, yet world fails to cut emissions again. And there's a question of whether we should move as a scientific community from this, if you will, information deficit model, where we say, oh, policymakers, politicians, they don't have enough knowledge, they don't have enough information, we should provide them with more reports and scientific papers, towards an understanding of the science policy interface that centers actually power and the struggle for power and different influences on the policymaking process. And there have been in recent years, more and more perspective papers and opinion pieces and reviews and reflections on, scientists must act on their own warnings. They should overcome the knowledge action gap. We should move from publications to public actions, doing less talk, more walk, rethink academia, and so on and so forth. And I should note my own positionality in this debate. So I have been quite active with a group called Scientist Rebellion, especially in the Netherlands. 3 years ago, we set it up, and it grew from a handful of scientists and academics from across disciplines towards really hundreds of academics across virtually all Dutch universities. And we engage in all kinds of campaigns against fossil fuel subsidies or private jets or coal mines, against gas extraction. And so I've been involved with organizing on that front, but I've been also involved with the more kind of standard advocacy work, writing opinion pieces in big Dutch newspapers, or going to panel discussions, talking to policymakers, and so on and so forth. So I just want you to know that this is the positionality that I have here, so I'm transparent here. And through this kind of work, my co-authors and I became interested in this question of what is the wider climate change engagement of scientists. And this led to a paper we published in August this year, and one that we published yesterday, focusing on climate and non-climate researchers. And I'm going to talk about those two papers in my talk. And this is joint work with these amazing people from the US and from Europe. So, and as I said, we were kind of interested in the beliefs that scientists have about climate change and their role in it, to what extent they engage in different forms of climate action and advocacy activism, but also kind of high impact lifestyle changes, and what barriers exist for them to engage more. And there has been, in the past, some work on trying to understand, scientists' general willingness to engage, or people have focused on health professionals and their view on climate change and health. Or a nice study by Victoria Colonia and others, also co-author of this paper, looking at what the German citizens and US citizens and also climate scientists believe about advocacy and scientists' role, or work that focuses on single high impact lifestyle changes like reducing aviation by climate researchers. And there's things like, this famous kind of nature survey of IPCC authors that was, kind of replicated, if you want, and extended by The Guardian earlier this year. So there's isolated previous work out there, but we really wanted to get kind of a perspective of the whole scientific community, not only of climate researchers, but all of them across disciplines, across countries, and that motivated our work. Now, what we did basically to get to this, because it's quite hard to sample the scientific community, right? You can go to conferences, or you can ask organizations, associations to spread the work through the survey through newsletters, but that's all a bit cumbersome. So what we did is we looked at the Scopus database, which has 27 subject areas, from ecology to psychology to dentistry probably. And we looked at articles that were published in 2020, 2021, and 2022. And we emailed the corresponding author our survey. And we sent about 250,000 emails plus 2 reminders. So almost a quarter, 3/4 of a million emails sent. And we were very lucky that in the end, around over 9,000 scientists and academics from 115 countries, virtually all disciplines, all career stages, were kind enough to spend their time answering our survey. And here you see kind of the distribution across the globe, where we're very good coverage in North America, right, in Europe, Western Europe, also in India, China, Australia, but less good coverage in South America and Africa and Russia and Eastern Europe. And that's almost structural in our survey, because we looked at kind of the top papers, we looked at the top scientists. So there's a structural bias towards, the Anglo-Saxon world. So just to note that. What was interesting, or what was nice that we could do, is we had basically, the 250,000 scientists and academics that we sent our survey to, and then we had the survey sample, so we could compare those two on features that Scopus provides, like the age index. You see that they're very similar. The year of first publication, you see that our survey sample is a bit later, so they're a bit younger. But the number of papers published, the total number of citations, they're quite similar overall. So at least on these features, the two populations are well matched. However, still, if you get a survey and it's asking about climate change and your role and your engagement, then it is not unlikely, it's probably likely that people who answer this survey, tend to be more engaged already have some formed opinions. So we don't claim that this is a representative sample of the academic community, which is very difficult to collect. But we try to do our best to approach that. Now, let me give you a little bit of a summary of some of the beliefs and actions, some of the beliefs scientists have, and some of the actions they have engaged with or are engaging in. So, we asked questions like, overall, how worried are you about climate change? And we had about 80% saying they're quite a bit or a great deal worried. We had over 90% agreeing or strongly agreeing that we need fundamental changes to social, political, and economic systems to address climate change. Also over 80% saying that substantial changes to personal behavior and lifestyle is required, disagreeing mostly that advances in technology largely will solve the problem. And many also agreed with the statement that environmental activists can drive positive change. Now, in terms of the responsibility and the role, over 80% said that scientific or academic institutions are responsible to address climate change. And many also felt a responsibility as a scientist, as an academic, to address climate change, not only in their role as a citizen in their respective countries. We also had more scientists and academics agreeing or strongly agreeing that they should engage in more advocacy compared to disagreeing. And similarly, more people agreeing than disagreeing, saying that scientists and academics should engage more in legal protest. This is now with respect to all scientists and all academics. We also asked a question about scientists and academics working specifically on climate change, and that the percentages were slightly higher. But you should also note here that a large percentage of respondents neither disagreed or agreed, so they didn't have a fully formed opinion on this question. But many also strongly disagreed or just disagreed that engaging in advocacy would diminish scientists' credibility. And similarly, more disagreed than agreed also for protest, although the absolute disagreement was lower than for advocacy. Now, turning the page a little bit to actions, we looked into civic actions or advocacy and activism actions, and then high impact lifestyle behavior changes. And in terms of lifestyle behavior changes, we have in green the fraction that already does a particular behavior. We have in purple those that will be willing to engage, willing to do the behavior, and then we have in orange those that were not willing to. And you see reducing car usage, reducing amount of flying. Many scientists have already done so. Increasing the energy efficiency at home. A few people are not willing to do that. It's kind of a no-brainer. Following a mostly vegan and vegetarian diet. Quite a few already do so, but also many are not willing to. In terms of this, I don't really like this item. You know, there was this paper, I think in 2017, by a couple of researchers that quantified kind of high impact lifestyle actions. And they said, well, the most impactful thing you can do is having one fewer child. I think it was like 60 tons reduction per year, which is absolutely massive. But they assumed that we will not decarbonize the energy system and that you inherit half of your child's carbon emission and a quarter of your child's carbon emission and so on. So we included it, but I'm not very convinced that this is a climate item. In terms of advocacy and activism behavior, many already talk with climate change with others, but also have engaged in advocacy and donated to relevant organizations and even engaged in protests and civil disobedience. And what is interesting here is that while quite a few are not willing to do some of these actions, a large part of our sample would actually be willing to do that, right? And so they face certain barriers to engagement, and I'm going to talk about those barriers in a moment. Now, what we also did in this second paper is to ask the question whether there are differences between researchers who work on climate change versus researchers who do not work on climate change. And we had one item that basically said, well, how much is your research related to climate change from not at all related to a great deal related. And so we took the kind of the edges, those that are not at all related to climate change and those that were related to climate change, and compared the percentage that reported to engaging in a particular action. So we dropped the willing to and only looked at the percent engaging. And what you see here is, first of all, the sample size is smaller, right? Because we only look at the extremes. And in red, we have climate researchers, and in blue, we have non-climate researchers. And what you see is, for the civic actions, there's quite a large difference for climate researchers than for non-climate researchers. And for some actions, like engaging with politicians, you probably would want such a split, right? This is kind of the Naomi Oreskes Merchants of Doubt kind of thing, where you don't want researchers who don't have an expertise, engaging with policymakers on these issues. For others, advocating change within institutions, you could say, well, it's not super important that you're climate researcher. You can do so also not working on climate change. But what we see here, there's big differences across these two populations. And when you look at lifestyle changes, let me go here, you see that the is considerably smaller, right? Here, switching to renewable energy at home, reducing flying, shifting to a vegetarian and vegan diet. And there are many reasons, there are probably many reasons for this. And in our paper, we discuss a few. One thing is probably that, these kind of actions, some of them at least, engaging in advocacy, engaging with politicians, maybe part of the job descriptions of climate researchers, right? So they have a tendency to do that more than non-climate researchers. And given their position in society, given their specific expertise, they are, of course, more poised to engage in these actions. For lifestyle changes, it probably doesn't matter so much that you know about carbon budgets. It doesn't make you a better cook, right? Or switching to electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are not cheaper when you study climate change. So the difference there is less pronounced, and these are also more difficult actions, right? Switching to electric vehicle, following a mostly vegan diet. These are big personal changes. Okay, now having looked at the beliefs and having looked at the actions, let's look a little bit at barriers to engagement. And we particularly looked at engaging in advocacy as a barrier and engaging in legal protest. And advocacy, we defined, I don't have the definition here, is basically, anything that is related to advance the cause of climate change through education, through teaching, through political engagement, to speaking out and so on, through speaking out. And legal protest, you know what legal protest is. Now, what we did here is two things. We separated. So first we did a quantitative analysis, and I don't want you to take this all in because it's a complicated graph, but basically what I wanted to show you here is saying that we looked at all these variables that we measured in, and we regressed them on two different populations, basically. So what we did is we looked at those who are not willing to engage versus are willing to engage. So what variables are related to, okay, I'm willing to engage now versus not willing to engage. This is in purple. And then we looked at those who are willing to engage versus to already engaging. And we then again ran a regression with those variables for that kind of binary comparison. And we also looked at open text responses that the participants provided. So we asked them for climate change advocacy and legal protest. Hey, you said you're willing to engage in these things. What barriers do you perceive that have prevented you from actually engaging? And similarly, we asked people who are not willing to engage. Hey, it seems you're not willing to engage. What barriers do you perceive to be willing to and actually already engaging? And what we came up with, summarizing, distilling the quantitative results and the qualitative results, is kind of a two-step model of engagement. And it's quite straightforward. It's basically here you have this, hip, young, upcoming, early career researcher who is not willing to engage and faces, barriers to be willing to engage. And at that level, it's mostly intellectual barriers. It's, low levels of worry. It's a lack of knowledge about climate change. It's a lack of efficacy beliefs, right? They're like, I don't have the skills to talk to the media. It's not the role of scientists to engage. And not so much practical barriers if you look at the relative height of these bars, which is, fear of repercussions, fear of losing credibility, and so on. Now, once that researcher has overcome this first step of barriers, she is then willing to engage, but still faces a number of barriers to be actually engaging. And here it's not intellectual barriers that dominate, but it is practical barriers. Like, again, fear of losing credibility, not knowing any groups, not having the time to engage, having a lack of opportunity. There are no protests in my area. You don't know any advocate in your inner circle that could, reduce the threshold of engaging. And I want to just read you a couple of open text responses for these different barriers, so you get a little bit of a sense of what the participants told us. Now, we had this a barrier of being not the role of scientists here for advocacy. And when I say 9%, it's 9% of the people who wrote an open text response said something about the role of scientists. So it's not super huge, but it's also not tiny. And this person said, I believe there is a fundamental conflict of interest in my role as a climate researcher if I engage too strongly in advocacy. Or I am a researcher, not an activist. Researchers should stay in their lane, or they may compromise the objectivity of the research, right? Scientists getting involved in political advocacy is a slippery slope, and I will not be part of it. Yeah. And here for protest, even fewer people said this is an issue. Activism is perceived as a political statement. Scientists must remain credible and should not be seen as manipulated to political agendas. And here I think I like this one because it's a more nuanced. It says it's important to, as an academic leader, to consider carefully what the most impactful activities at a particular career and life stages are. A misjudged interaction can undermine potentially more powerful influences available through different routes by changing perception of evidence versus advocacy. It's a fine line. So basically, this person says, "Look, I'm in a position of power on some level as a full professor. I'm talking to policymakers, to politicians. In my role, it may be counterproductive to engage in protest or civil disobedience, right? And these are real concerns for people in such positions." Now, there was a nice exchange. I mean, there was this opinion piece by Ulf Bündgen, I think a geographer at Cambridge University, saying it's very important to distinguish climate activism from climate science, and people shouldn't mix them, and they shouldn't engage, and so on, and we should be value free, and we should stay neutral, and so on. There were a lot of should statements in his article, indicating that already this discussion of should we engage or not engage is a value judgment, right? And Christel van Eck and others had a very nice response to Bündgen's comment, which if you're interested and haven't seen it, if you're interested in this notion of role of scientists, I can highly recommend following this debate here. Now let's look at a few others. Advocacy, right? This was more important. Lack of skills. I don't have the status, credentials to advocate strongly for climate change action. Senior academics would have stronger impact. I feel I lack the skills or training to discuss and advocate in a non-preaching way. Lack of efficacy beliefs, right? It could be a waste of time because policymakers in the media tend to listen to more louder voices than mine. I'm not really convinced. I would need to see evidence that the campaign of advocacy is impactful, and so on. And for protest, quite a few people mentioned kind of potential adverse effects. So this person said, it definitely comes with a certain risk of your engagement affecting your reputation. Not everyone within the scientific community agrees with you being politically active. And that's an interesting point, because this person doesn't say, oh, I'm fearing the loss of credibility with the wider public, but I'm fearing actually, pushback from other colleagues. And if you look at the empirical research at public engagement of scientists by Victoria Colonia and others, you find that actually many members of the public would like to see more engagement by the scientific community, especially the climate science community. And there's quite some work by John Kocher and others looking at scientists advocating a certain issue on credibility and finding that it does not reduce the credibility and the trust in science more broadly, and also the scientists advocating. And we've also done some research that is a registered report that will, I think, get published maybe in January, where we looked at scientists engaging in civil disobedience and whether it reduces the credibility of that scientists who engage in civil disobedience or science more broadly. And we also don't find an effect here, or backlash effect on credibility. And it's interesting also here that there's this beautiful paper by Naomi Oreskes, what is the social responsibility of climate scientists, where she talks about James Hansen and his political engagement, and how he kind of is perceived by the wider public as a hero, and is certainly one of the most famous climate scientists alive. But within the academic community, he's perceived as a little bit of an odd one out, engaging in civil disobedience and so on. So it's quite interesting, this social norms within the academic community and the fear of pushback. Here, protest disagreement with activists. This was mentioned quite a lot. This person says, I don't support the organizations and movements associated with climate protest, for example, Extinction Rebellion, as they are too politically extreme, use methods that I don't like, and tend to link the climate issue with other leftist political agendas, equality, queer ideology, and so on. And the most important thing for protests actually here, lack of opportunity. Protests do not commonly occur, if ever, in Japan, particularly rural Japan, where I work. Now, let me talk a little bit about overcoming barriers. We have a discussion of this also in the paper, where we look at kind of intellectual barriers and practical barriers and give some suggestions of, if we were to wish to overcome them, how we would overcome them. And one very effective thing, when it's about lack of worry or lack of knowledge or not the role of scientists, is to facilitate interactions with those who are worried and engaged. And this is more and more happening at big conferences like the American Geosciences Union's General Assembly, or the European Geosciences Union General Assembly. I was there in Vienna earlier this year. I think it was in April. And there were a lot of events organized by Scientist Rebellion and other climate scientists who want to engage more. And there were debates and courses and reflections and discussions about this changing role of scientists as a community. And there are no right or wrong answers here. This is something we have to negotiate as an academic community. How much can we engage? Should we engage? Want to engage? Acknowledging our different positions, senior academics, early career researchers, our different skills, but also potential impacts, in terms of credibility or other routes of change. So that's something we have to discuss and continue to negotiate and reflect on, especially as the climate crisis worsens. Changing to curricula to include relevant knowledge. And as I said, this loss of credibility is largely unfounded. I see somebody in the chat asking whether these quotes are available somewhere. I didn't see a link to your paper. This is in the supplementary material, which is, 50 pages of supplementary material. And you see a table where the quotes I picked from are available, and a bunch of others as well. In terms of practical barriers, there's lack of time, right? And this is kind of almost a structural issue in the academic system, right? I mean, we're being paid mostly to produce papers, right? And that may not be aligned with having impact on wider society. We have to teach, right? It's a very precarious employment. I mean, I'm a postdoc. My contract ends in July. What am I going to do after? All these things come here. There's not a lot of money or funding for engagement. It's something you have to do, as an add-on to your publishing, to your teaching work. And if your publishing work goes down, you might just get seeded out in this competitive dance that we're going on here. A lack of skills, fear of repercussions, right? Some of this is institutional reform. As I said, these are kind of systemic problems. To allocate more time to engage with society, to provide funding for this, to reward and normalize climate actions, right? So that this is very important, these social norms. And I think this is maybe one of the most important things Scientist Rebellion and other groups like Scientists for Future or Faculty for Future and so on are doing, is providing a space for scientists who you would like to engage in that, right? And then almost normalizing, there's this group Scientist Rebellion, they have big talks now at big conferences. Okay, it seems this is shifting, right? In terms of not knowing anybody, lack of opportunities, right? I think international groups can really help set up local groups and get the action going there. Now, to summarize, a large majority of the scientists we have surveyed across disciplines, across 115 countries, across career stages, are very worried and believe that we need fundamental system change. A majority of them believes that scientific institutions are responsible to address climate change, and that scientists should engage more, both in advocacy and protest, although, a large chunk is kind of neither agreeing or disagreeing. So it's something we have to continuously reflect on. Many scientists already engage in high-impact lifestyle changes and civic actions, and many more are willing to do so. And then we identified a number of intellectual and practical barriers to engage in advocacy and protesting in the paper, then suggest ways to overcome them. Now, I want to thank you for your attention. You can find the papers and the slides and everything on my website. And Blue Sky apparently is kicking off. So if you want to connect on Blue Sky, feel free to do so. Cheers. I'm happy for questions.
Thank you so much, and Fabian, for an absolutely outstanding and very much an eye-opening talk.